but also you see the boundaries. It's not very clear, but to the west, in Zambia, you can see the Ruangwa River, and then to the east, the Zambezi River. So that was a part of the Malawi kingdom. Now, I want to move on now to discussion of the development narratives and what was the development narrative of Malawi in the pre-colonial times. And it is important to note that even before colonization, there had been travelers to this territory. You had the Portuguese that left some documents about the Malawi kingdom, but also the Scottish missionaries wrote extensively about what they saw, about what they encountered in Malawi. So the narrative which emerged from such interactions was that Malawi was a rich and a resource-endowed territory. We have a lot of evidence, discussion about the rich soils, the land, availability of the water, the wildlife, and the people that were producing a variety of items, crops for sale, but also extractive commodities that were being used for trade. So all this information is available. And reading through the works of David Livingstone, Rankin, and the others, you get that picture of a territory that was endowed with resources. And as a result of that, the subsequent discussion that emerged was now to appeal to the British government to introduce protectorate rule so that there can be proper connection with the use of raw materials for the industrial development of Britain at the time. And some of you may have come across the readings. David Livingstone made public lectures when he came back to different universities when he was appealing for people to go to this beautiful country, rich country, so that they can establish their plantations and at the same time establish schools, missions, etc. And but one other aspect which is coming out of that literature is that the success of this territory depended to a large extent on the European settlers establishing their plantations and at the same time working together with the Africans. And so this was the understanding of the kind of economy which was to be developed at the time. So now the creation of the new economic system, this entailed a fulfillment of some Enlightenment ideals, which are famously captured as the 3 C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. And indeed, we see that in many respects, these were fulfilled. Chris had no doubt about it. A lot of African territories, including Malawi, was Christianized as a result of the efforts of the missionaries. And also in commerce, upon abolition of the slave trade, what was described at the time as legitimate trade was introduced. And this indeed helped the different communities to start participating in the new economic system that was set up. And then obviously, as civilization, we had so many schools, hospitals, clinics, And but in addition to that, what is also significant for the economic system was now the introduction of new cash crops. The cash crops that to this day are being produced in the country. Talk of coffee, cotton, tea, and individuals that were coming, like Buchanan, who were bringing some of these crops from Scotland, and interestingly, took so many seedlings, but few survived, which they planted. And the start was a little bit harsh for some of these crops, but in the end, some of these crops survived, and they were upscaled. Then we also had the introduction of markets. The markets for some of these commodities that were being produced, new ways of farming. Again, the colonial state also helped in this regard in ensuring that new ways of farming were adopted by the Africans in order to achieve the objective of having a vibrant economy. And also issues to do with land and labor, that how do you control, how do you access land? And very controversial matters initially, especially to do with the land, but in the end, the new economic system provided now for the categorization, demarcation of land, and also introduction of ownership rights, etc. So these are some of the aspects of the new economic system that were put in place immediately upon the establishment of protectorate rule, and that going forward, these aspects would now become critical. And when we'll be looking at the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we'll see the ways in which the Chamber also tried to work on these issues to make sure that indeed the economy was guided by ensuring that there was security, for example, in terms of land, and that labor was available for the production of crops, and also that the markets were provided for those crops. So the chamber became like a gatekeeper, ensuring that there was proper attention being given to these issues in order to support the new development, the economic development of Malawi. Now, moving on to the colonial times, we see now the birth of two narratives. And the first narrative is that Malawi was a poor territory, very different from what we saw in pre-colonial times. And so where is this narrative coming from? Malawi would now be described as a poor country. It cannot stand on its own. It needs the support in order for it to survive. Secondly, we have the narrative of the labor reservoir, and that Malawi really should be the source of cheap labor to be used not just within the territory for the plantations, but also in the region. That labor export to South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and even Northern Rhodesia, Zambia. And you see ways in which this narrative really worked towards ensuring that Malawi continues to export labor. And to this day, I'm sure most of us know that this narrative has not died. It's still there in different ways. But the argument that was raised at the time was that Malawi could not survive on its own because it was constrained by certain structural factors. And firstly, that it's a landlocked country, and therefore it's very difficult to export, especially bulky crops, whether one is talking about coffee and even the food crops, if there's surplus maize, that its transport becomes very, very expensive because of its landlocked position. And then related to that again is the issue of absence of exploitable minerals. Unlike other countries in the region, where the minerals had been found or there were prospects that minerals would be available. But in Malawi, there was no study that confirmed at the time existence of exploitable minerals. And that situation led to the belief that Malawi was going to be a poor country for quite some time, and that the only sector of the economy which can sustain the country was agricultural production. And hence the emphasis in agricultural production, and then later on the service industries. Now, as I said, that the new economic system was to be supported by settler production, and to some extent also by the peasant sector and also labor migration. So right at the outset, we see that Malawi was involved in export of labor. Immediately, especially after 1910, Malawi was exporting labor to South Africa and also to Southern Rhodesia, and later on from the 1950s to Zambia. Then the peasant sector was very, very small, producing largely food crops, but the settler sector was producing cash crops, tea, tobacco, coffee. These were crops that were being produced by the settlers in the country. And so at the same time, just to buttress the point that Malawi was a country that had difficulties standing on its own. You see that from an early stage, the country was receiving support from C.C. Rhodes' British South African Company to the tune of 10,000 pounds, sorry, not dollars, pounds every year. And this money was meant to support the Nyasaland government. Then later on, when that was discontinued, and again at independence, the budget of Malawi could not balance. And it's the British government which came in with support to assist the independent Malawi to balance its budget. Of course, later on things changed. That support now was not available, and then the country started now balancing the budget. But another issue is that of the call for federation, which for quite some time the settlers have been calling on the British government, colonial government, to federate Nyasaland to the two Rhodesias. And the idea was that it's not workable for Nyasaland to be an independent territory. And I'll discuss again also later on this one, but the idea was that Nyasaland is struggling. And especially after the Great Depression of the early 1930s, the plantation sector was badly affected. And so there was a lot of discussion to say, why don't you make Nyasaland to be part of Rhodesian Nyasaland? because it's failing to survive on its own. So that was the part of the narrative. So now I want to move on to the case study of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and to see how some of these ideas were being taken up by the chamber, members of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Malawi, just to highlight these narratives which had been created at the time of colonization. So we want also to show that the chamber can be viewed as an instrument for advancing the commercial interests of the settlers and to some extent the colonial state. At the same time, it promoted class interests of both the whites and later on the blacks. We see over time, especially after independence, that the chamber was now being led by the Africans. But they maintained some of the ideas, the narrative which had been created initially. And also it's an observation that throughout its operation, its existence, the chamber also served as a forum for nurturing individuals into politics. We see that quite a number of people that served in the chamber ended up also working in politics. So the chamber itself, just a bit of background, was established in 1892 under very, very difficult circumstances, because at that point, the settler community was fairly small, about 1% of the population, but very, very influential. And so in 1892, I don't know how to pronounce whether it's Shera or Shara, but he established what he called the Shire Highlands Planters Association. Unfortunately, Shara had disagreed with John Moyer of the Kabula stores in Blantyre. And therefore, John Moyer proceeded to establishing his own association as well, the Nyasan Planters Association, in the same year. And these disagreements lasted for about 3 years, but in the end, with the intervention of some other members, they came together and therefore formed what was known as the British Central Africa Chamber of Agriculture and Industry. And although moving a little forward to say that the disagreements did not end here, even up to the 1920s, there were always disagreements. And the governor had to intervene to bring together the conflicting parties, and he encouraged them to form one common association organization. But well, despite these disagreements, the chamber still had a lot of influence on policy and also in terms of engaging the state on matters to do with the economy. So I'll highlight just a few here to give an indication of ways in which the chamber tried to influence policy and maintain the narrative of now Nyasaland being a poor territory, one which cannot survive on its own. So under cash crop production, there was a call on government to improve the conditions for the production and marketing of crops, such as coffee, tea, tobacco, and cotton. And as I said, these were the cash crops being produced by the settler community. So for quite some time, even during the times of the Great Depression, the settlers had been asking the government for ways in which they could be bailed out because they encountered huge losses and some of the plantations closed. So they were putting pressure on government to make sure the conditions improved, but also access to the markets, that transportation of these items to the nearest export routes. So the issue of the rail construction, this again was a big issue in colonial times that the chamber took up with government. They wanted a rail line to be constructed between the Shire Highlands region. So the Shire Highlands region is an area including Blantyre, Zomba, Mulanje, Cholo, and Chirazulu. That's what was known as the Shire Highlands region. And this is where the European settlers had set up their plantations or estates. So connection to the east. So I got a quote there from the Central African Times, which was the mouthpiece of the chamber, calling upon government that it had a duty to inform the Colonial Office in London of the serious position which faced the country, and that a rail line had to be built or taken up by the government at once. And so this was the issue that was raised by the chamber. And indeed, as it was to be, later on, the government listened and started constructing, connecting Beira to Blantyre. Then the other issues about land. This matter is quite critical. When the settlers had arrived, they obtained land using different ways. And there was no clear system for land acquisition. And Harry Johnston, who was the first British consul, had actually instituted a commission of inquiry to find out how land was obtained. And in the end, he came up with a non-disturbance clause that those Africans that were staying on their own land should be left without disturbance, but also came up with a system of classifying land. So there was land that was obtained now as freehold, and it was held for a period of 999 years. Then you had leasehold land, and so this came as a result of the individuals whose rights were not very clear, but now the government had to give them permission to use the land for 99 years. And then there was also land, crown land, which was land belonging now to Her Majesty. And then it was in the administration of the government through including the traditional authorities. This category changed later on. It was converted to customary land. But the point I wanted to make is that now the Chamber of Commerce and Industry was opposed to the idea of allowing new immigrants to settle on the land which had been taken over by the settlers. There was a crisis in the 1920s in Mozambique, where a lot of Lomwe-speaking peoples now migrated in large numbers to Malawi. They were running away from the harsh policies in Mozambique, and they were seeking refuge in Malawi. And some of them stayed on the plantations as squatters. So at that point, the chamber came together and with a position to say no immigrants should be allowed to squat on the land belonging to the settlers, the private estates. And but for Johnston, this matter was to be accommodated. It was supposed to accommodate because they had agreed that about 1/10 of the land should be given to the Africans to stay there in exchange for labor. That those immigrants could stay there as long as they worked for the estate owners as part of what was known as Tangata or forced labor. And that labor would be converted into rent, that they can stay there for as long as they wished, but as long as they're also providing labor to the owners of the estates. But the chamber was again opposed to the recruitment of labor by external agents. Remember, I indicated that after the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, now the opportunities were opened for workers to be coming from different places to go and work in the mines. Since the British had defeated the Boers, and now the territory was in the hands of the British. But the chamber was opposed to that. They argued that that initiative deprived the settlers, the planters, of the much needed labor force for the estates. And that Malawi did not have a surplus of labor at the time. And this is interesting because earlier the narrative talked about Malawi being a labor reservoir. But now at this point, there was a change in the argument to say that Malawi needed labor. And they wrote a very strongly worded letter to government challenging the decision to allow the recruitment of laborers in Malawi. And so I just quoted that. We're saying Nyasan government should be drawn to the serious situation created in the southern province by migration of labor. Not only did it result in a shortage of labor on agricultural estates, but shortage of food supplies normally grown by the natives themselves, and et cetera, et cetera. So they were even threatening that hunger or famine would occur as a result of the massive migration. So despite this position taken by the chamber, of course, the Nyasan government allowed the export of labor. So Malawi was continuously exporting labor to South Africa, Southern Rhodesia. And because that was also critical for the remittances, because government was benefiting. So when people went to work in foreign countries, a portion of their earnings would come to government. So it was a difficult situation, but the government allowed that, much to the disagreement of the Chamber of Commerce. The other issue is that of political representation. And right from the establishment of the Legislative Council, this was the equivalent of Parliament, but in 1907, the Chamber called for the inclusion of some of its members. But the Colonial Office in London rejected that request on the grounds that it did not want to subject the Africans to the mercy of the planters. So this would become a very, very controversial matter for quite some time. Although the government then allowed some members to participate. And its position was that it had the imperial duty or responsibility to safeguard the welfare and interests of the indigenous peoples in the protectorate. So, because at that time, Malawi was not a colony. as I indicated, Malawi was a protectorate. And unlike the other colonies where you had the proper structure in terms of administration, this was a kind of trusteeship that after some time, the British would hand over the power and authority to these indigenous people, the citizens. But practically, and with time, Nyasaland became a colonial possession of Britain. So that's why initially they allowed unofficial members. And one such member was Alexander Hitherwick, and a prominent missionary at Blantyre Mission, and who served as an official member. And he was there to represent the interests of the Africans in the Legislative Council. Then later on, as the structure of the colony was being transformed, we saw also the inclusion of other members. There was Kidney and Bowie, who equally served as unofficial members. There were others, Marshall and the like, who also served in that Legislative Council. So I'm moving on now, the last aspect on which the Chamber of Commerce and Industry worked on so hard. This was the issue of the federation. As I indicated earlier on, that due to the narrative that Nyasaland could not survive on its own, there were pressures coming from the settler communities that it should be part of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. And the issue was that it would benefit from the economies of scale. And that would help also in terms of the transportation and to the rail lines, et cetera, et cetera. But the chamber was also taking advantage of the report that had been prepared by Hilton Young, who had, to some extent, also accepted the idea that it was possible for Nyasaland to have some kind of a closer association with Nyasaland, Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Southern Rhodesia. He did not come out talking about federation as such, but he did point out that indeed Nyasaland needed the support of the more developed, more endowed territories like Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia. So now the chamber wrote to the government to say, if complete amalgamation does not prove practical politics at the present time, it is necessary to consider the possibilities of schemes of federation or closer union. And this is what they had written now, asking government to consider. So you can see that from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, there was this talk of the federation. And they made delegations to come to Lancaster House, to London, to discuss with the colonial government to make sure that indeed the federation became a reality. And after so much resistance, now the British government granted that permission to have the federation, 1953. But it lasted only for about 10 years. After that, it broke up. But indeed, this was also an issue which the Chamber of Commerce and Industry had been working so hard to make sure that it helped, in their view, to make Malawi survive, become a strong economy. This is just some I was just trying to show the individuals who were quite prominent in the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So one other person is Hind. He was a farmer, publisher. I think he went initially as a missionary, but became a farmer and a publisher. Very, very active in the chamber. and he was the publisher of the Central African Times, the one which was being used now to convey the messages of the chamber to the government and other interest groups. So, but also of interest is the fact that there was a lot of competition for the positions within the chamber during this period right from 1892 all the way to the 1950s. Individuals were fighting for these positions, and some of them kept on coming for the second time, third time, but this was a very influential organ in the territory. So now briefly moving on to the independent Malawi. What we want to highlight is the fact that membership in the chamber was predominantly that of the European settlers right up to independence. And there were very few Africans, those that had land or some small businesses, but they were not prominent at all. And in terms of the issues, the chamber continued to highlight the same issues which had characterized the colonial times, talking about production, markets, trading, transportation, access to loan facilities. And because like in the colonial times, there had been discussion to say government should set up a land bank to be providing the loans to the farmers as they are done in Southern Rhodesia. And after independence again, there were discussions to say the government should provide loans to assist the Africans also to become entrepreneurs, to become good business people. However, there are some notable changes which also took place at the same time. And firstly, as I said, some Africans and Asian people also joined the chamber, but they did not have the leadership positions. We also see that the state more or less captured the chamber. After independence, it wasn't as strong when it comes to discussion of political participation. So most members toed the line of the government at that time. There was also the establishment of a party organization, the African Businessmen Association, but later on it was incorporated into the chamber. And then we see also the establishment, another change in the 70s, the organization of trade fairs and etc. Then the narrative which had been created at the time of colonization continued, that Malawi was a poor country, and we see also that labor migration cannot be stopped. So South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and Zambia continued to get labor from Nyasaland, although the conditions for recruitment had changed. Previously, there were organizations, Tandizi, Wenera, which had been recruiting labor, but afterwards, it was a new arrangement, including Teba. And that only stopped when there was a plane crash in 1974. But that again stopped the official recruitment of labor, but unofficially, labor has been migrating to different countries. Then in the 1990s, again, we see other changes, perhaps more significant changes than the period before that. We see that the leadership has changed hands, and non-whites took over the positions of leadership in the chamber. There was also political activism by some members, as I will show later on, that this is the time of the transition to multipartyism. So quite a few members from the chamber participated in the political process. But also we see the rise of women entrepreneurs, although their role was very much in non-lucrative sectors, and they did not even take up leadership positions. Then we see also the chamber now aggressively engaging with the state on policy matters such as the issue of liberalization of the economy and also the floating of the currency. So at this point, these discussions were taking place, being led also by the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, so here I was just trying to show, again, political activism here, individuals that were associated with chamber, but became also active in politics. So see there people like Muruzi, Sam Pasu, all these had been actively participating in matters of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that the chamber did not just take into account the commercial economic interests of the members, but also the political interests were being taken on board. So I now, moving to the end, just a few closing remarks. To begin with, the chamber served as an important forum for advancing the economic and political interests of the entrepreneurial groups, whether the settler community or indeed the Africans after independence. And the key sectors which were critical to the economy of Malawi were agricultural production, trade, and transport. And these defined the economy of Malawi. And around these aspects, we see that there is a lot of discussion, a lot of drive by the chamber to make sure that the policies are in favor of the interests of the chamber or members of the chamber. But again, the chamber facilitated the production of a powerful political and economic elite, and which again has been quite critical in defining the economic development of the country. When it comes to involvement of women, the chamber had allowed the inclusion of the Nyasaland Council of Women to be a member, an affiliated member, and also the National Association of African Business Women also became part of the chamber. But their role was not as prominent as that of the men. And then another aspect is that of political activism. There was a lot of political activism throughout the history of the chamber, save for a few years between the 1940s and the 1970s. But after that, we see quite a number of individuals taking on important political positions in the running of Malawi. So I would like to stop at this point, and thank you very much for your attention. Right.
We have some time for questions. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask, either in the room or online, I'll monitor online as well to make sure there's no questions. You can either maybe put the questions in the chat if you're online, it would be the easiest. Please.
Really fascinating. Some of the speaking stopped somewhere in the 1990s. I wouldn't know what at the level was what do you think the role of the chamber has been in Malawi changed a lot? What would you have been since that kind of transition, like in that
Should I take a few? Take a few maybe.
Yeah. We're going to take a few questions and then answer them all. Okay. See, we've got a question online from Lorraine, if you want to ask that live. Oh, sorry, you were there, but you were on mute again.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Perfect, Jay, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Lauren Imponera. I'm from Malawi, but I live in England. Thank you so much for your presentation. It really provided a lot of history that I didn't know it exists. So thank you. But my question is, so this information that you have presented today, is it in the book that you showed us at the beginning? Because I'm really interested in reading more about this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Oh, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, very clear exposition of a very large area. And one thing I was interested in, you mentioned that there was very little African representation in the Chamber of Commerce. I think one of the good things. One, when did it start? And second, was in the earliest times, what was the attitude of the people on the Chamber of Commerce, people like RSI, to the Malawian and entrepreneurs, where at the time, like Daniel Mota, Chisuse, Natural Work, and other more important ones. How did they feel about the growing class of African entrepreneurs? Thank you.
Answer those things.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. Now, with regard to the first question, the chamber has continued to transform itself, to be transformed after the 1990s. And obviously, the influence of liberalization, economic liberalization, political liberalization has had an effect on the way in which it operates. And I haven't worked that much to get the details, to do a complete analysis, but my sense is that after that period, indeed, we see the chamber also becoming quite vocal and quite active. But the information is not adequately captured in the way that one finds if you go backwards in history. So also just one issue which is probably more prominent here is that the trade fairs, the organization, this has continued to be done after the 1990s. And we also see that the political participation of some individuals is also continuing. Quite a number of individuals that have been working with the chamber, you see them also active in politics. But this is something that I would have to also spend more time working on. Yeah. There was a question to say, is this information available in some book? The answer is no. It's part of my research that I've been working on for some time. And I'm continuing with the study to make sure that I complete the data collection and analysis before I can publish this. But you can be rest assured that perhaps in the next 2 years, I should be able to publish something out of this. And so that will also take care of the developments after the 1990s. Now, the question about when Africans joined the chamber, this was from the 1940s. And at that point, there were very few. Actually, there were about 3 Africans and 1 Asian person of Asian origin who had joined the chamber. And these were estate owners as well in the Shire Highlands region. But as I indicated, their role was not as prominent. They did not hold any substantial positions in the executive of the chamber.
Please.
In terms of, I knew that the Malawi into the Federation in 1963,
Yes.
were they in it until independence, or did they leave the Federation pre-independence? So why?
Right. Okay. Right.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry. I was just wondering about, and it kind of relates to these questions a little bit, as I was thinking about the regions that are represented in the chamber.
Mhm.
So in terms of the membership,
Mhm.
changing over time, do the regions that are being represented in the chamber change over time? Or does it tend to be concentrated of membership of people from a particular area in Malawi rather than the full country itself? Oh, one more over that. That's what we're looking for.
Thank you. All right.
Sure. So one more, please.
And then once you decide to go and settle there, apart from using the data, we get issues of income or any other thing that is being provided apart from just this land.
Okay. 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 All right. Thank you very much for those questions. The first one about the protectorate status of Nyasaland. This is a big issue. And as I hinted at the beginning that Malawi was a Scots place, if I may put it in simple terms. And the Scots had an interest in the territory. They had made connections with the people, and they did not want to be disturbed by people from outside. But when the threats were now coming from outside, so they appealed to the British government not to establish this as a colony, because with the colonial system, it meant that the British government had to appoint like a governor or the head of the administration to be in charge, and all the relations will be going directly, or the major decisions going to London. But the Scots were saying, can you just assist us to safeguard this place? And that after some time, it will be handed over to the Africans. So we had a few other protectorate territories, I think Botswana, Lesotho were also protectorates. Yeah. So, so initially that was the case, but with time, as I said, that things changed. Malawi was governed now like a colony. And because now the decisions began also to come from London. Yeah. With regard to the federation, it ended before independence. I think it was in 1963 when the federation ended and independence was attained in 1964. But the reasons for the termination of that federation were quite many. At that point, a strong voice had emerged, particularly in Nyasaland, Malawi, to work against the federation, because the Africans in Nyasaland, Malawi, felt that they were like second-class citizens. They were being treated as second-class citizens to those in Southern Rhodesia. And it was like the big brother syndrome that you're at the receiving end and there's nothing that you could do. All the resources were going to Southern Rhodesia. So there was therefore a campaign to end the federation. And even Dr. Banda, when he was here in the UK, and he used to support the efforts to fight against the federation. So there was mobilization of the chiefs, but Malawi worked with Zambia as well to fight against the federation. But Southern Rhodesia was not interested to end the federation. And in fact, Werenske had even written in one of his books where he said he doesn't see the federation ending, probably not in the next 100 years. Yeah, exactly. But it ended in less than 10 years. Yeah, exactly. So now in terms of representation, the chamber initially had members concentrated in the southern part of the country. And this was the economic hub of the territory. And talk of all the cash crops that have been grown in this region. Later on, from the 1930s, 1940s, the central part of the country also joined through the leadership. There were some settlers who opened up tobacco plantations. I think Wallace and anyway, I've forgotten the other one. But these were the prominent settlers who organized also their colleagues to be working with the chamber so that they can benefit from the decisions that were made by the chamber. Now, in terms of provision of free labor, what had happened is that in order to allow the immigrants to settle on the plantations, there was double responsibility on the part of the settlers, the immigrants. Firstly, they had to provide labor to the owners of the estates. And secondly, hard tax had been introduced. So hard tax required that every person had to pay tax. But how do you pay tax if you don't have crops that you can sell, if you don't have a stable source of income? So the challenge was that those individuals that were running away from Mozambique, they had to find land where they had to produce the crops. And it wasn't easy. They went to the estates, settled there. There was an agreement with the owners that the owner of the land would pay tax on behalf of the immigrants. But they also had to work for that owner as part of the land which they had been allocated. yeah, for them to settle there. So it was a way in which they were also now able to clear the obligations with the state on taxation.
Well, one more question on the chat, so we'll take two more questions and then let you off the hook there. Eunice, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, I have a question, Prof. Thank you so much for the presentation. I am interested in understanding especially the continuities and the idea that we have presented concerning land, and how I understand it was also a matter of concern for the nationalists when they were fighting for independence. And so I want to understand from that time that we achieved independence and like in general continuities after that period, how has the question of access to land, especially for the common man, been an issue? How has it fared?
Thank you, Eunice, thank you. And then,
Okay.
yeah, one final question. Oh, sorry, another question there, that's okay, please.
Maybe, right, you know, given the environment was, I think in the narrative in Malawi, what narratives have you tied in? For the country, what would the reflect be? How you know we get it?
All right, yeah, please. Thank you very much. I'll start with Eunice. The continuities in terms of land, what I can say that the position has been very controversial when it comes to land. We don't have a unified voice regarding the land, but at the time of independence, the government made a decision that the status quo would prevail. There was to be no disturbance to the land arrangements which had been prevailing in the colonial times. Of course, there were to be some voluntary processes of the settlers giving away land for settlement of the Africans. And then later on, of course, after political liberalization in the 1990s, there was a land reform process which made several recommendations with regard to land. But as you probably may find in the literature, some of the works, that this matter has not been fully implemented. We have a new land law, and which again is raising some issues. It was passed, I think, should be around maybe 2012, 2014, but it was revised again more recently. And there's still a number of issues, particularly on the matter of foreigners owning land. And I think that is one of the issues, the issue of registration by each and every person who has got land, including family land, customary land. All those issues are under consideration. And there was a pilot scheme with the registration in some parts of the country. But this is not coming through the agency of the chamber. So we have a different set of players that are pushing for the land reforms in the country. This is maybe what I can respond with regard to land. Now, on the matter of narratives, indeed, the narrative of Malawi being a poor country, that one has not been erased, it's continuing. And in fact, it's becoming even more glaring than was the case before. You have a lot of discussions and literature. If development partners' documents would start by describing Malawi as one of the poorest countries in the world. And, but issue is, when exactly do we start describing Malawi as a poor country? And of course, the indicators have changed for poverty. That we must acknowledge. The other narratives which have been silenced, for example, is that of Malawi as a labor reservoir. But we see that there is still export of labor, and in different ways. It's no longer just going maybe to Zambia or Zimbabwe, but it's changing directions. In some ways, going to the Middle East, labor, and then also but South Africa still remains an important destination for labor, especially for the young and employed youth. And the issue to do with the role of the, class narrative, what you see that it's no longer being described as a major issue, as a narrative, but the reality on the ground is that a number of key estates which are producing export crops, you still have a few settlers and Asians who are dominating, and a few prominent Malawians. So class-wise, again, we see that there's some continuity, but the narrative is not as prominent as was the case before.
Thank you so much. I think we should let you off the hook now. I just want to thank you so much again for that fantastic lecture, especially just because Prof has been here all week working in his role as Vice Deputy Chancellor, so he's been very busy doing that, and then also gave this lecture, so very much appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving us. I believe we're going to have a few words from the Scotland Malawi partnership.
No, just very quickly, because you covered it there, we can start with my partnership. I'd like to thank David was getting at University 25 for hosting the lecture today and for arranging the venue. And yeah, once again, to welcome for making squeezing in this lecture for us during this visit. It's been fantastic. So thank you all for coming in person as well. And for those of you still online. So thank you. And yeah, good rest on your way home.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Right. Okay. Okay.
Please stick around and have more tea and coffee if you like. Please download the free book and take some free literature from the front as well.